Hello, brewing enthusiasts. It is a crisp, exhilarating 8 degrees here in Springfield, Illinois. Would love to know what temperature it is for all of you. Chat it up. And if anyone has over 70, we're going to be jealous. So today's hangout is about grind. And it's a noun, it's a verb, it's what brewing enthusiasts love to talk about because we need to take a whole bean and transform it into a liquid. So we're going to talk about the slicing and the cutting and the smashing of the bean and how we then gain it into extraction. So many of us, I think the first time we were introduced to the idea of how grind can impact contact time. Was anyone given one of those cylinder examples? You know, take a cylinder and fill it with rocks, or take a cylinder and fill it with sand, and then pour water over each of them. And you'd see that the water would move really quickly through the rocks, and then it would sit for a long time through the sand. And then with that, you realized how important grind is for contact time. And we all know that contact time is what gives us a lot of the flavor that we get out of coffee. The other thing that happens is when you walk into a coffee bar, we're like Pavlovian dogs, right? We hear that grinding sound and we say, oh, I love it. And then we smell the freshly roasted coffee. And we know then that it's going to be great and it's going to be made fresh for us. So grind is our topic today, and grind is all about how do we find the sweet spot. We're going to be asking our brewing enthusiasts, how do they set the grind particle size for the recipes in what they're creating in their cafes, in their wholesale accounts, and then also as they're guiding through so many home consumers that are asking them how to make great coffee. You see the chat feature for all the attendees. Please use it. If a comment comes up and you'd like to add into the conversation, use chat to all. If you have a question, use chat, and then we'll be directing those to the brewing enthusiasts. So let's meet our brewing enthusiasts today. Let's start over on the East Coast, and we have a brewing enthusiast that got his start when he was a barista in college. So please welcome brewing enthusiast Andrew Sutton.
And for their retail customers, and really excited to get to be able to connect with you guys today and talk about grind.
Great, super. So now going from the East Coast, let's head over to the West Coast and say hello to brewing enthusiast Ben Jones. Ben had warned us that his home office is near some chickens, so we might hear chickens in the background this morning. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, everybody. I'm Ben Jones. I'm with Patrick from Bronson Coffee Roasters out of Olympia, Washington. We also roast in Atlanta, Georgia, but I'm out here West Coast. I'm the West Coast trainer. Also have an extensive background in competitive coffee brewing, so my love really does lie with the simple filtered black drip coffee. And I do apologize, I do have chickens right over there, and it is frigid in my little office today, so we're bundled. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you. Staying on the West Coast, let's move to the LA area and say hello to our brewing enthusiast, Bailey Manson. Welcome, Bailey.
Hi, thanks, Carolyn. My name is Bailey. I work for Intelligentsia Coffee, and I'm the innovation manager there. So I manage a bunch of different products, bringing product development, bringing new things to market, and also a bunch of equipment testing. So that's where we're relevant here. Also came out of retail, so very familiar with being an educator and developing recipes and working with baristas and being a barista. So it's been a couple of years, but still work on it as recently as this week. So
fantastic. Thank you, Bailey. And staying on the West Coast, let's say hello to brewing enthusiast Marie Franklin.
Hi there, I'm Marie. I'm in Portland, Oregon, snowy today. My background is pretty varied. I've roasted, done green trading and product development. Most of my expertise is in on the sales side, so I'll be sharing a little bit about that today. I was most recently with Umbria Coffee Roasters, though I'm unaffiliated right now, so if you want to talk, find me on LinkedIn.
Great. And say hello to Kirsten Helm. She is very close physically to Ben, but they are in separate locations today. So brewing enthusiast Kirsten Helm.
Hello, everyone. Yep, I am just north of Ben and a little bit more north of Marie today in Olympia, Washington, and I'm really excited to chat with our panelists here, and for everyone who wants to join in on the conversation, please do so in the chat feature, and we'll keep an eye on that. Yep, I'm a regional account manager for Bun over in the Pacific Northwest area, so today we have 5 inches of snow, and I'm very excited for that. So yay for snow days.
Yay. Great. And last but not least, we have 2 brewing enthusiasts here in Springfield, and I'd like to introduce Doug Bishop.
Running on screen. Hello, everybody. My name is Doug Bishop. I'm a Director of Beverage Innovation here at Bun-O-Matic. I've been in the restaurant industry for, I don't even want to give my age away, but since I was 13, I was a salad boy at Charles's restaurant in Miami Lakes, Florida. So, bartended, I've bussed tables, but in the coffee industry, I've been involved for about 31 years. 11 years as a service manager for an OCS company. The last 4 years of that roasting with them and learning all the aspects that I could take in from that. Came to Bun-O-Matic in 1999, started as an engineering tech, worked on our juice machines, coffee, all of the different lines of equipment, and and always been intrigued with brewing coffee and all the aspects of it. So happy to be here. And now, if you want me to make the introduction. So now my cohort in crime is Cheryl McLean. Cheryl?
Hi everyone, I'm Cheryl, and yes, to Doug's point, we are cohorts in everything. We're starting to earn a nickname as the dynamic duo. So what he does in hot, I do in cold. So I got my start in the coffee industry, actually in the Bay Area. I worked for a coffee roaster out there. I started in their training department, which was awesome, and then segued into wholesale account management. So I really got to get a great picture of how cafes, restaurants were doing coffee and some of the challenges they were experiencing in that. And then a couple years later, I moved out here to Illinois. I have to say this is the first time I had to put antifreeze into my gas tank. Never had to do that before, but had to do it today. So something new every day. And with Bun, I've been here for close to 7 years. I started in business development and then into product development. Now I'm in beverage innovation with Doug. So excited to talk about grinding today.
Great. So brewing enthusiasts, let's go to our first question for the group here. In our Hangout, we're talking about grind today. Grind particle size, grind distribution curves, fines, dust, all those great topics. So let's start off and hear from our brewing enthusiasts some of their philosophies on grind. And Bailey, can I call on you first there to lead us off?
Sure. Wow. Okay. So grind, I mean, the first thing that I think about when I'm thinking about grind is just I sort of skip all of this like screen sizes and microns and everything like that and kind of cut straight to the brew. And for our coffees, usually what we're looking for is they tend to dial in. They tend to be optimized at the highest extraction that I can get from them possibly. So That's often like in the 22, 23% range. And so I'm looking for a grinder that can just access the most extraction possible. And so I'm often not looking at, this bell curve and how many fines there are or whatever, but I might look at two grinders side by side and say which one's giving me the most extraction. So I'll just start brewing through the dial and just grinding finer and finer and finer and plotting where that extraction's going on a chart and look for it to go up, 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 up. And at some point it'll peak and then start to go down again. And this is what we call the point of diminishing returns that I think a lot of us are familiar with. And I'm just looking for the grinder that gives me the highest peak. And that tends to be what I'm looking for most of the coffees. We also have, at least at Intelli, like a few different tiers of coffees, and they have different target extractions for them. They're optimized at different levels, and there's different expectations around different coffees. And so it's not that we can only work with this one grinder or these couple grinders that have the highest peak, but there are different applications. And so, there might be a second tier of coffees that is optimized at a slightly lower peak, and there's all these other grinders that work fine in there. And so we test a bunch of equipment, and then we pair them with the coffees and the applications that suit that best. So that's I think a quick nutshell of how I tend to approach it.
Awesome. Bailey, when you're talking about that sweet spot and diminishing returns, help us understand, so when you get to that sweet spot, are you looking for like a combination of body and certain nuances, or how do you describe sweet spot?
That's actually a great question. So Intelli, we actually don't really talk about body very much at all at Intelligentsia, as we see it largely as determined by like the precursors in the green, and then as a result of roast, and then it can be manipulated by like brew method. But I'm not necessarily trying to manipulate body through extraction necessarily. So we're thinking of it more in terms of like TDS as the concentration and extraction percentage as the development of flavor. And so generally I would think about we sort of just know like through experience, like within the context of our coffees, that most of them are optimized around a concentration of like roughly 1.4 TDS. So it could be slightly higher. Certain coffees are all the way up to 1.5, some even a little bit lower. But as far as extraction goes, we also know that like that's not really like telling us a lot of detail. It's just sort of like how much you pulled out of this. And it's this blend. It's not super informative, but again, we look at it within the context of our coffees, and we do have like a correlation between what we experience as the flavors and those numbers. And so we expect as those extraction percentages go up from 18, 19, 20, 21, et cetera, that we'll see the acidity sort of increasing, but increasingly getting balanced out by sweetness. And we're trying not to push into any bitterness or carbon or anything like that, but ultimately looking for this harmonious balance between sweetness and acidity. And where we reference the target for that is actually in a cupping bowl. So we would throw a cupping bowl on the table, look for the relationship between the sweetness and the acidity, find out at what intensity levels those are and how they relate to each other, and then look to replicate that in the brew, which is basically just by increasing the extraction and the concentration up to the point at which that's like mimicked. So, yeah.
Wow.
I think that answers it.
I hope that's recorded somewhere. What a fabulous description of that process. That was great. Thank you very much, Bailey. I'd love to go to Ben Jones. And Ben, same question. Grind particle size, distribution. Tell us how you get to how to set a grind recipe, grind particle size for brewing.
Excellent. Yeah, this is a really fascinating part of my job because we offer wide range of coffees at Batter from Bronson. We have your traditional Italian and French roast coffees, blends that have those darker components. But then we also offer a lot of more select medium and lighter roasted coffees, and all of these need a very different particle size to really pull the best flavor out of them. It's a big ask to ask our customers to buy different grinders for all those different types of coffees. So what I like to do is, when we're looking at grinders, we definitely want to have, just like Bailey said, we're not obsessed with the particle distribution curves. You're going to get some boulders, you're going to get some fines. As long as we're not getting so many fines that it chokes up the brew, we're going to be pretty happy. So assuming that the grinder is in good condition and is being cared for, I like to adjust what the grinder is doing by tweaking what the brewer does. And we've been seeing a lot of really fantastic innovations over the last handful of years with brewers that do more than simply just pour water onto coffee. We can start to do different recipes that have, we can control not only the number of pulses and delivery cycles of water, but we can also break those up into irregular and asymmetrical sort of patterns to enhance extraction caused by the agitation, or we can reduce extraction by reducing that agitation. And that's been an incredibly fun part of my job. I like to think of grinders sort of as, it's kind of the part that you're stuck with in a way. Someone hands you a tool and you need to find out as many uses for it as you can. That's how I, looking at grinders when our customers are using those. It's what they have to work with, so we're going to do the best we can to adapt with them. And it all comes down to taste at that point. So I spend a lot of time in the cafes with my customers, fine-tuning and tweaking the recipes that we've created in lab.
Oh, that's really a great description. So you're saying that you kind of have oftentimes the grinder as keeping them the same, and then you're adjusting your brewer and using the tools there to pull everything out. So for example, like if it was an Ethiopian medium roast, we know every coffee is going to have its own unique coffee distribution curves. So then what would you be doing on the brewer side to adjust for different grinders? Are you increasing pulses? Are you using more pauses? Is there anything from a brewing enthusiast, a philosophy that you've been utilizing a lot?
Yeah, so if we're looking at a medium Ethiopian, I'm thinking real high density coffee, we're going to need, given the same particle size as would be compared to, let's just say, a French roasted coffee, if those particle sizes are the same functionally, we're going to need to have a lot more contact time with the bean and the water. So we're going to use, I'll probably give a large pulse up front to get that initial bloom and the pre-soaking. And then turn off the pulses and watch the water stream so that it dies out, not to where the stream stops, but just really slows down. We're getting hardly anything coming out. Then I'll deliver some more pulses, and that'll cause the rise. And at that point, I'm trying to peek up into the brewer. It's kind of fun. I took my daughter to work one day, and she's watching me brew coffee. I'm looking up into the little space in the brewer, and she's like, "Is this what you really do for work?" And you're watching, trying to make sure that water level doesn't rise too high and that it doesn't drop too low. You're just manipulating pulses to keep it, and then for that Ethiopian to broaden out that brew time as long as possible. Whereas on the Italian or the French roasted coffee, something darker, we're going to want to try to get what we can out of it, and be done with it, maybe even use some bypass.
Oh, that's great. So I think for the brewing enthusiasts that are attending today, how many, come on, be honest, have spent time looking at that little space between the brewer and the brew basket? If you have, admit it. Say, yep, I did it, in the chat.
Sure.
That was a great description, Ben, and if not to put you on the spot, but I think a lot of people are interested in your experiences in competitions. So can you share with us anything about the trend of getting really tight distribution and if that works to hit tasting nuances, or your thoughts on it?
Sure. So competitions are really fascinating things. We need to acknowledge, first of all, that we don't behave in our day-to-day life the way people do in competitive sports. Whether you're talking, auto racing or baseball, basketball, any of those sports, our pickup games are nothing like that. So we shouldn't do the same thing we're brewing at home. The Brewers Cup specifically, you score really well when you give incredibly specific and narrow flavor profiles. The goal is to definitely brew a good cup of coffee, be able to speak well about what that coffee was, but most important, and where all the points are, is can you tell us exactly what it's going to taste like? And the more specific you are, the better you're going to score. So for that instance, complexity is, it's dangerous. You want to have a coffee that'll have 2, 3, maybe 4 incredibly noticeable and clear notes. So that's going to impact your selection of coffee. It's going to also change the way you brew. So you're going to be reaching for grinders that have documented incredibly narrow bands of particle distribution. You're also going to pull out sifting tools to try to minimize things. A good analogy would be the differences between baking cupcakes, small loaves, full-size cakes, with all those different sized, little treats. If you put them all in the oven together, they're going to bake very differently. And to win that baking contest, you're going to only bake your tiny cupcakes together in their designated oven, the small loaves together in their own. So for the Brewer's Cup, the more specific you can get with your particle size, the easier it is to control all your contact time, know what exactly your extractions are, and then be able to tell the judges, these are the 5 things you're going to taste in here. But at home, you're not going to do it as much. You're maybe looking for a coffee with more complexity. Also, the doses of coffee that we use in competition is kind of absurd. If you are sifting out fines and boulders, you're going to lose quite a bit of coffee on either end. So if your target actual brewing dose is 19 grams, you're throwing away 4 grams on this side, 2 grams on that side. When you're buying a bag of coffee, that adds up pretty quick. Also, when I did AeroPress, my winning recipe for that, I used 26 grams of coffee for like a 10 or 12 ounce cup, and that's just way too much coffee to be, it's way more than you need to be using in a day-to-day. So competitions are fun. They do drive some innovation and some learning, some good education there, but it's definitely not the model for daily brewing.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. That was fantastic. Let's ask Doug Bishop a little bit about his philosophy on grind, and also interested in the topic of fines versus what we sometimes think about being dust.
First of all, Ben, that was great. Unfortunately, some of the stuff that you said took my thunder. So, no, really appreciate what you said about that. I mean, we get a lot of questions about, grind distribution, how tight can we go in our grinders, and across the industry, we hold it pretty tight. From Bun's standpoint, might be not the tightest, but I really like what Ben said about, trying the coffees out there that may have 4 notes, flavor notes. I look at Batdorf, in this case, Batdorf and Bronson, and their flavor descriptors when I get a coffee in and a whole bean, and I look at those notes, and that's what I'm trying to get out of that coffee. If I am trying to get too narrow of a grind distribution, I may miss some of those notes I would get from those coarse ground coffees segments, and I'll get a different flavor from the fines. So a floral note that may come from a large ground particle size that needs more time to soak, but since we have one consistent time, that particular larger coarse ground coffee may give us a little bit more of that floral note that's just starting to develop. So it'd be on the left-hand side of the chart under the 18%. And then you get into the 26%, you may have a little bit of that. that's bringing in a carbohydrate or a different finish, a clove finish, or taking it all from just milk chocolate to a dark chocolate. So, you know, if you get too narrow of a pattern, you may be missing those segments. And that's what I've found over time in all the brew recipe development that we do internally. Obviously more important because you have much greater flavor notes in the specialty world with fresh ground coffee. So we really want to capture all of those essences and the nuances that bean has to give. Another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about too is just the difference between light roast, dark roast, what you'll get in fines. If you have a large particle, a fine particle distribution in a light roast, it could be the size of the bean as it enters the hopper. It could be the way that it was roasted. If during the roasting process they did a water quench versus an air cooled, the water quench will tend to yield a bean that's a little bit softer. So you may have some differences there. There's all the different fermentation processes that are out there that can add to how that bean fractures during the grinding process. And I touched on it as well as just the roast profile. Generally, I find that decafs and dark roasts will have a greater distribution profile just because the fines, that brittleness of that decaf bean losing all that moisture over time during the roasting process, and a difference between 20% moisture content and 16% can yield a higher number of fines at the end of the process. So, thank you. So, me.
Great. Let's go to Andrew in Greenville, South Carolina. Andrew, tell us your philosophy. You've had the experience of barista, working with a lot of wholesale customers.
Yeah, I think for me, a philosophy that I like to try to figure out, like, how can we reverse engineer like our brewing process and kind of like demystify things, like whether it's someone at home trying to brew things or a wholesale client. I want to find out like where they are, what's their goal with whichever coffee that they are using. So I want to kind of reverse engineer that, okay, and be like, all right, they're looking for a coffee that is going to be like really sweet, really chocolatey, just more of like a daily driver. And like I want to kind of brew with them through the dial and kind of really educate them on, you know, maybe some accounts for people who don't have access to a refractometer to like have like these TDS numbers and extraction rates and stuff like that. So we're going to go through and brew through the dial and really hone in on their taste and what they're looking for, so that they can get a better idea of when they have a coffee and they're tasting coffee, where do they want it to end up? What's their goal? So just trying to educate them and meet them where they're at, wherever they're at in their coffee education and knowledge, and just trying to get them to be able to kind of have those kind of instincts of trying to figure things out, reverse engineer, and get coffee to taste how they want it to taste, to, you know, have that great cup of coffee at home, or, you know, have a good cup of coffee and a consistent cup of coffee as well, and as their product in the wholesale world.
That's great, Andrew. Great comments, especially about consumers and making coffee less intimidating. We're now going to go to our brewing enthusiasts, and Kirsten Helm is going to lead us through some discussion on operations. What are brewing enthusiasts doing in the real world to make great coffee?
All right. Hello. Good morning. Thank you, panelists. That was awesome. And I think such a great transition into our next section. Because some of the items that we talked about, you know, as far as those grind parameters and grinding for competition and what that looks like and how to articulate that to our wholesale or retail accounts and bring that, you know, into sort of their level and bring it to them, and how we can help them brew the cup of coffee that we want them to brew, but that they also expect out of your coffee. So I believe that each of our presenters has worked or is currently working in a company that has both retail operations as well as manages various wholesale accounts. And both retail and wholesale definitely present their own unique challenges. Where retail, you may have more control of the products, the equipment, operations, level of engagement, which is certainly a challenge to execute well. Whereas wholesale accounts are challenging because you're working with a variety of customers across many channels, who will ultimately bring different levels of education as well as different levels of motivation to learn. So I also think it's important to note here that in the past, maybe 15 years ago or so, coffee offerings were, somewhat limited. You'd have your dark roast, your French roast, another dark roast, maybe a medium dark roast that you'd call your house blend. But whereas now, where roasters had their go-to, 3 or 4 go-to blends, we're now seeing at least 3 or 4 single origins with go-to blends and limited time offerings, seasonal coffees. And consumers some are still enjoying those dark roast coffees. We definitely need to acknowledge that, a nice consistent dark roast. But we also have consumers who are not only requesting coffee by region, but they're also requesting coffees by farm. So, which is great, but it has to be, somewhat overwhelming as we're trying to communicate to those who are preparing our coffees, to get them set with the best tools and the best knowledge, and like what Andrew said, meet them where they are. I love that. So with all that being said, I'd like to ask the group a few questions, and perhaps we start with Andrew, if you don't mind, because I really would love for you to elaborate a bit more on meeting them where they are. So like specific to your wholesale accounts, how do you have conversations around grinding, equipment, the importance of consistency in operations, specific to grinding, and perhaps share some techniques that you have used in the field to convey the concept of grinding. I mean, I totally have used rocks and sand, and I think it paints a great visual, but I'm sure there must be more ways out there that we can convey the message of grind extraction or grind size and extraction yield.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think hopefully, first off, if someone's carrying your coffee, hopefully they trust you and they're really into whatever you're doing just in general. So that's already like a good place to kind of start off. But you have that rapport, and the client has that kind of trust within you. So mainly it's been kind of meeting them where they are. What kind of client is this? Is it a restaurant? Is it a hotel? Is it a specialty coffee shop? Is it more of like a second wave coffee shop? Like all those kind of factors kind of play a big important part. So just trying to figure out like where they are and once again, kind of reverse engineering, like what are they trying to do? What are they trying to get out of their coffee? So yeah, I mean, definitely rocks versus sand. That's a huge thing, kind of like talk about brewing knowledge and stuff like that. But it's also about equipment recommendations and like different brewers and setting up those brewers and stuff like that. I think a main thing is like, say it's a restaurant and they are kind of maybe rushed on time. They're maybe not quite so either service staff. Maybe we can throw some equipment in there that kind of already pre-doses a grind, like the Petco GR2s. I put those just kind of help with getting a consistent product without sacrificing too much like time, or maybe the restaurant doesn't really have that need to like have this pinnacle of coffee at a restaurant. Like they want to serve a good coffee, but they don't necessarily need all like the just like new technology. So I think like trying to meet people where they're at and get things that really work for them and just kind of serve them. Like we're in the service industry, it's all about serving. So I want to make sure that like I'm not putting anything too over their head, but also just like meeting them where they're at and getting a good product to them.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like that. I think it's important to meet, various customers where they're at. And I like your example of the restaurant industry, but also guiding them. They have trust in you, and you're helping them. You want them to be successful, so you're also going to help them, whether it's pick the right coffees or the right equipment. I think that's great. Along those lines, I wanted to maybe jump over to Marie. I know you've done a lot of work with wholesale accounts and developing recipes, and wanting to know, like, is there any tips or tricks that you have used in the field, whether it's you developing a coffee profile and how you communicate that to consumers in the field, because there is this variation of education level and engagement, and sometimes we do have to meet them in that mix.
Yeah, for sure, happy to. So I think that it's important to recognize that there are these different needs, right? So we, as roasters and educators, need to have all this. We need to have the knowledge, but I think that we can't expect everybody else to be as woke as we are about this, right? So wholesale accounts, again, might not have, not only might not have the interest, their customers might not really notice if a coffee is not perfectly brewed. And we have to help them really focus less on the most latest techniques and focus more on just getting a good, consistent taste. So I use the example of making pasta. So if I make pasta at home, is it going to be better? Of course it's going to be better if I make homemade pasta. But I don't very often, and I don't, not just because it's a pain in the butt, partly because dried pasta is pretty good, and I'm happy with that. So I think that we have to recognize that in a restaurant, if we can get a pretty good taste, I think that's a win. I don't want to diminish the role that we have, that we are the educators. We need to educate, inspire, push them to be better. But I think sometimes taking some of the factors out of the equation is serving the customer best, because it's giving them consistent taste. So I'd like to bring in just one example we used at Umbria. I have a lot of respect for their approach, and we worked very hard to help meet each customer's needs differently. So in our cafes, or in their cafes, consistency in equipment, very important, top of the line equipment, and maintaining that. The cafe managers and trainers actually, they know grind science, and they may actually maintain their own grinders themselves. So they pull the things apart, they change burrs, partly just so they have that intimate relationship with grind. So some wholesale customers want to adopt those practices, but for the most part, Umbria takes grind out of the equation. So similar to what Ben said, just there's enough you can tweak on the brew recipes. You don't need to be changing grind for a customer. So their approach is doing portion packs, not only in drip coffee, but also espresso pods. So espresso pods might seem kind of old school, but I'll tell you, I would much rather have an espresso made with an espresso pod most of the time than a restaurant trying to contend with a grinder with, dirty machine and the wrong grind and mismade. So their success making a pretty good espresso is pretty consistent. So I understand that's not, it's not everybody's approach, but I think it's an approach that is working for them and can be used more in the industry.
Thank you. I think that brings, that's a great perspective. And I also really appreciate how you address what the consumer is looking for too. And sometimes that's maybe different than the barista, or it's the consumer is somebody we really have to take into consideration when we're creating coffees, because they're the ones that are really driving this. They're the ones who are wanting these different variations, these LTOs. So I think that's a great perspective. And kind of to keep going on that, I would love to hear from, possibly from Bailey or Ben or anybody else who has like retail accounts and wholesale. You're working on both sides. I would love to hear some of the challenges or some of maybe the areas that you focus differently between your retail accounts and your wholesale accounts, and how that works when you go into account.
Alrighty. Well, I actually have probably the least amount of wholesale experience out of everybody here. So I came out of retail, spent a lot of time there, and have continued to do equipment evaluations for both retail and wholesale. But then I will often default to other people at Intelli for their wholesale or distribution experience. So I kind of take that similar approach of like trying to just acknowledge that people have different expectations, different sensory targets, different capabilities. And also that, we're not, kind of like what Marie was saying, it's not about dumbing things down, but it's about simplifying things. And that simplification makes it repeatable and makes it consistent. And that's what, going back to Andrew's differentiation, whether it's a hotel or a restaurant or specialty bar, like every one of those different accounts, they all can care about repeatability. So in general, when I'm looking at equipment, that's like one of the biggest things. Can this be done the same way over and over again? And the more steps there are, or the more pieces of equipment there are, the longer that checklist gets between somebody ordering a brew and then that brew getting served, the more complicated it's going to be, the more unlikely that that's going to happen the same way every time. So, in retail, we can get super specific. And we actually do sort of the opposite. We actually have our brewers are all locked in and they don't change. So every coffee that goes into the brewer comes in at the exact same like time and flow rate and pulses and et cetera. And we're only changing dose and grind. So it's an interesting, it's sort of like the opposite of what we're doing on, I don't know. It's a different approach, and they both work. I can see, and it helps. Listening to you all talk about it actually helps me understand like why I can program so many different brew recipes. And it's like, here's my Ethiopia, here's my Costa Rica, et cetera. We just don't do it that way, but we do for some wholesale accounts where it's like, oh, here's this. Maybe I know that they serve a decaf and then they serve frequency or something like that. And I know that those generally do need like notably different recipes. And so we can either lock in a grind for them where it's like, you always have to move this dial here and here, or we can keep that fixed and do the brewer. So it is different for them, and it's case by case, but in retail it's the other way.
Very cool. Thank you. Ben, did you mentioned something in our meeting the other day about when you make things too easy, sometimes they don't need to take care of it. And this is jumping to kind of the next question that I had for Ben and Cheryl, but I really would love to hear you elaborate on that, because I thought it just kind of like rung in my head when we were discussing in our meeting prior on Monday. But equipment obviously comes with, it's great. It can make things simple or sometimes more convoluted, but as we try to make equipment kind of take those variation factors out of it, but also like you got to maintain it, and having accounts maintain their equipment can be somewhat challenging. And I'd love to hear from Ben, Cheryl, or really anybody, but like how important is it that people are taking care of their grinding burrs, and how do you convey that importance to accounts?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts on that. The wholesale roaster's dream is a new account building out from the ground up, all brand new equipment. It happens sometimes, and we love it when that's the case. But often we're having somebody who's switching roasters coming to us for the first time. They've been operating for years. Sometimes we get somebody who's buying all used equipment for a new venture. Andrew mentioned the GR2 grinders. Those are the ones that have the 2 hoppers. You push a button for large or small, whichever side you want to grind. They both pass through the same grinding chute, and it gets the same treatment. Those are amazingly simple, user-friendly grinders, and for certain accounts where, like restaurants, he mentioned, their biggest concern really is labor expenses, and then training for the servers. The servers are so busy doing all that emotional work and the memory with serving the customers, they don't need to know how to do all the technical stuff with grinding. The easier to make it, the better. But the challenge with that is those grinders need a little bit of love and attention, something more than just wiping down the outside or vacuuming out the chute. But they're not going to do it. They're not qualified to do it. They're not interested in learning to do it. And their labor standards for hourly expenses can't hold that. So I find myself going in fairly regularly and pulling the grinders, swapping them out so I can take them back to the shop and give them the deep cleaning that they need. Just a fun thing. I went to work with a new account years back. This is years ago. And they had no notion of care for their equipment. So their espresso machine, their brewers, and their grinders were all in quite disrepair. I took apart the grinder, separated the birds out, and the birds were completely coated with old ground coffee. I took out a little brush and I brushed those things as clean as I could. And underneath that compacted coffee grounds, the birds were sharp. They were almost brand new underneath all the coffee. So for about a year, they had just been grinding coffee beans with hardened coffee. That would be very much similar to if you went out and bought a nice kitchen knife set and you were afraid of dulling the blades on the knife. So you just, instead of taking the knife out of the block, you just took the whole block and started smashing your vegetables with it. The maintenance is an important piece. If I talk to my mechanic friends, I am not taking care of my cars the way they think I should. And I need to remember that when I'm talking with customers. So we do what we can, and selecting equipment and simplifying equipment is such a huge deal. But yeah, so maintenance is important. Even on the brewer level, in this same account, their spray heads on their brewers were so calcified. I think they only had maybe 2 or 3 holes that were actually letting water jet through, and that's, I'll make a cup of coffee, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, it'll make a cup of coffee, but it might take like 10 minutes. Cheryl, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I loved how Ben used that analogy, because for me, when in my wholesale days and when I used to do some account visits with the restaurants and with our trainer, some of the things that we would try to make it easier for them to understand is think of it like, coffee is a craft, and a chef, cooking is a craft. And so with chefs, they sharpen their knives. They have to do that on a routine basis. And that's the same thing that you would have to do with the burrs in your grinder. You kind of have to think of it that way. And when we make that comparison or analogy with these restaurants, it seems to register more. And some of the other things that the roaster that I work for did as part of trying to maintain that consistency was working in kind of a scheduled PM to try to take the pressure away from the staff. So some of our brewing enthusiasts mentioned earlier, you want to meet them at their level. Andrew said that, and Bailey also mentioned, just the consistency part and trying to make things easy. So did Ben, so did Marie. So it's that was one of the other things that the roaster that I work for did was try to kind of schedule in as part of a package, a wholesale account package, was the preventative maintenance. So we did get a question in from one of our viewers, and I want to open that up to our brewing enthusiasts. What are some of the products that you guys would recommend, or kind of a process for cleaning and resetting the burrs? Are there some products out there that you guys can recommend to the audience? Maybe Ben or Bailey or Andrew, if you guys can share your ideas on that.
Yeah. Can you hear me there?
Yep.
All right. So yeah, for cleaning, whether you're talking about a home grinder or a commercial grinder, the first rule is contrary to, don't just send a bunch of rice through it. Your grinders aren't designed to grind rice. It will clean it, but also damage the burrs. The second, the best way to clean it is to, anything is better than nothing. Bare minimum, get a small shop vac vacuum cleaner and just vacuum out chutes to prevent ground coffee from building up. Beyond that, the deeper you can get into the grinding chamber and get ground coffee off, the better it's going to be. I like grinders with easy access and easy reassembly. One of the best tools you have is really just like get a nylon brush. Don't use a steel wire brush, don't use a brass wire brush on burrs. Just like a nice nylon brush to brush those teeth clean. Soft cotton cloth, them off, and vacuum out the grind chamber. The idea is that ground coffee is, you have sugars and have oils, and those things get into moisture, they start to get sticky, and then they constrict and build up. Just pulling off as much of that as possible. There are some other products, mentioned rice, which we're not going to use. Some of the grinder cleaners, a lot of people I know really like those, and those are great products. I tend away from them only because it's an efficiency cleaning thing, maybe a laziness. When you send that through, you flush a bunch more coffee through to purge out the cleaner. You end up vacuuming it anyway, so I just leave those out and I go straight to the vacuum. I don't know if Bailey, do you have any other thoughts how you do it retail side?
Sure, yeah. So we just do basically what you said, vacuum and wipe things out. You know, we used to open up espresso grinders every night, and we used to open up our brew grinders every week and do that detailed cleaning on that regularity. But then we started to experiment and see like somebody would forget, and then nothing bad would happen. And so we started to experiment and see like how long we could push it. And it turned out that we rarely open our grinders now, actually. So we definitely vacuum them and wipe them and brush them every single night, so you can't see anything from the outside, at least, from like going up through the chute and then also going down into the burr set. But they're only getting deep clean, like pulled apart, where you're actually working directly on the burrs like quarterly. And so, and I think during COVID even less frequently than that because volume is just down. So, but yeah, that's been totally fine. And I think for us, it's because at least in retail, we don't have any oily coffees in the building. And so it just, like, there's no need for a cereal or anything like that. Like, we just don't have the same impact when we're working with our light coffees. I mean, we blow through burr sets faster because of the density, but that's the only thing.
Thank you, Bailey. As we end our time together for our hangout on Grind, I'd love to throw out one question to brewing enthusiasts. Either chat your answer, or for our speakers, share with us. Let's think about innovation. Is there anything you're using in grinding that you'd love to share with the group? An innovation, and also, is it a fad, or do you think it has staying power? How about you, Marie?
Well, mine's related a little bit to Grind, but it's more really focused on for wholesale customers. I feel like our industry is behind on digitizing customer care. So we all know that grinder problems are most often solved in an in-person visit, and I think that we could be much more efficient and really meet customers' needs through video chat and integrated systems that help us maintain a digital relationship with our customer.
Great. I totally agree with that. Bailey, how about on your end?
Innovations around grinding?
Yeah. Do you see any fads? What's here to stay? Any closing thoughts here?
I think that grinding is just really hard. Like, I think that the fact that we even have to have this conversation in the first place, and that we're talking about simplifying things or condensing things and like trying to meet people with that, like what's behind all that is this is difficult, and we understand why it's difficult, but we've also acknowledged throughout this call that it's so difficult to explain that to others, and it's one thing to try to explain it to a wholesale account, and a whole other thing to explain it to home brewers. So, Ben was saying the other day when we were talking about all the single serve growth and the single serve formats that exclude grinders, and I think that's a great point that he brought up. And I think in general, whether it's people brewing coffee at home, wholesale accounts, or even retailers, roaster retailers, I think are going to be exploring ways to eliminate grinding from the process. So I think there's a lot of different ways that can happen, but I don't want to give out too many secrets.
Thanks for sharing that, Bailey. We totally can relate about that stuff. And I just wanted to share what we're also seeing out in the market as well. I mean, some people we've heard are freezing roasted coffee beans, and how to do that in a manner where you're not introducing moisture while it's frozen, so that you're not tainting or affecting the beans. So there's arguments for and against that. So the against would be the introduction of moisture, but then for it, people are trying to get consistency and efficiency. And what I mean by that is you're able to preserve, so flavor preservation, freshness, those are the arguments for it. And then as well as on the operational side, they've been able to, there's been a couple of research papers out there where if you take a frozen bean and you grind it, there's more chance of a more uniform particle size distribution, and therefore you're able to get a higher extraction out of that brew. So those are some of the things that people are experimenting out in the field. And then to Bailey's point, taking grind completely out of it, there's new options out there where you can just order sachets and you just steep it into your cup, and you've got this excellent brewed coffee. For the home market, it gives them more access where they don't need to have the elaborate coffee setup at home. They can just order these sachets. There's also instant coffee. There's a company that is developing these pods that you could just drop into the hot water. So it's just interesting how the industry is evolving to all these different types of innovations that makes it more open for everyone, which is just so fabulous. So.
Brewing enthusiasts, it was great to get together for the last hour. We all want to thank our panelists for their insights. We enjoyed the hangout on grind particle size. I know tomorrow when we walk into a cafe, we'll all think about smelling freshly ground coffee and what it means in the cup. So thank you all, and have a wonderful Friday.